All right, now last time we were discussing some of the central problems connected with the notion of rationality. And I said there were 6 principles that I found in the literature. I suppose we could have listed 4 or 10, but anyway, those are the 6 that I thought were most common. And they're the ones I was brought up on when I studied philosophy and economics as an undergraduate. And I won't write them all out again, but they're first that all actions are caused by beliefs and desires. And I said if cause means causally sufficient conditions, then that makes free will impossible. And rationality presupposes free will. Why? Well, again, to put this very succinctly, because rationality has to make a difference. And if you have no free will, if everything you do is completely determined, it's all written in the book of history at the time of the Big Bang, then there's no scope for rationality. So, and Kant saw this, that rationality presupposes freedom of the will. What is freedom of the will? Well, we're going to get to that. Secondly, I said if you think that rationality is a matter of applying rules algorithmically, you get the Lewis-Carroll paradox. What's the right way out of that? The right way is to see, and this is the third point, that rationality is supposed to be a separate faculty. It's not. Constraints of rationality are built into intentionality and above all built into language. So the picture in the classical model is, well, first you can think and then you can talk and then you get rationality. No, it's not like that. To be able to think and talk is already to have entities that are subject to the constraints of rationality. To be able to think, you have to realize that inconsistent beliefs won't work, that it's not a good idea to act on beliefs that you know to be false. So the constraints of rationality are already built into thinking. And indeed, if you get language, you have much more powerful structure of rationality. I mean, language is a much more powerful vehicle of thought than pre-linguistic intentionality is. But you don't first have language and then get rationality. Rational constraints are built into the very structure of language. Such questions as, how do you know? What are your reasons for saying that? But what you say now is inconsistent with what you just said. Those cite the fact that your speech acts are already subject to rational constraints. Now we get to the fourth point, and that is that the primary desires are not themselves subject to rational constraints. I'm going to discuss that at some length today. And there are 2 aspects to that. The first is, as Hume says, that reason is and ought to be the slave of the passions, that you've got to have these basic desires before you can do any reasoning at all. And the second is that's supposed to be a consequence of that, and that is that there can't be any desire-independent reasons for action. And that view has received a very powerful expression in Bernard Williams's article on external and internal reasons. Williams argues that there are no such things as external reasons, that any reason must appeal to something in the agent's, what he calls, motivational set. And motivational set is a shorthand, basically, for desires, inclinations, and all the rest of it. But desire, as he concedes, is the most broad term here. So there can't be any internal reasons for action. I'm going to come back to that in a moment. Then the fifth point was akrasia, or akrasia, as I like to call it. And I've already discussed that, so I won't continue discussing that unless somebody wants to raise it. And finally, there's one that we haven't considered, and that is that the set of beliefs and desires has to be consistent. If you have inconsistent intentional states, you can't use rationality at all. That seems to me a profound mistake. The set of beliefs might be consistent, but there's no way a set of human desires could be consistent. You can't want one thing without frustrating other things that you want. So I'm going to come back to that. But today I'd like to really focus on 3 issues. One is the issue about primary desires. Are they subject to rationality? And then related to that, the view that there are external as well as internal reasons for action. How is that possible? How can there be such a thing as a desire-independent reason for action if all intentional voluntary actions are expressions of a desire to perform that action here and now. And then the third thing, if we get to it, I've been putting this off as long as I can. It's a bit like root canal work, and that is the problem of the freedom of the will. I mean, I'd rather talk about it in French or German, because when you say nonsense in French or German, it doesn't sound so bad. You know, la volonté libre and freie Willens, all that kind of crap. But I'm going to have to say it in English. I gave a lecture at the Collège de France where I said, I was lecturing in French just, to show off or whatever. They think the idea of an American philosopher is already a contradiction in terms. But some bastard gets up and gives us a lecture in Parisian French. I mean, anyway, I did it. And in the course of this, I said, pour moi, la langue de la réalité, c'est anglais. And there was a gasp of horror. I said, the language of reality is English. And at some deep level, I'm a real provincial here, I'm convinced really they must be thinking in English, and then what a job to translate back into French or German. They got to wait around for the verb in German. Who knows when it'll come. But in any case, I'm going to give you this lecture in English, merciful to both of us, to all of us. Okay, so here goes with the issue about primary desires and internal and external reasons. Any questions so far? I mean, last time we covered a whole lot of stuff, and if you want to challenge me on any of that, now's a good time. Also, I can put off talking about free will for a few minutes longer. I mean, my problem with free will is very simple. I don't have a solution. Most questions I get asked in philosophy, I think, well, I have a kind of solution. Maybe it's going to be wrong in the long run, but that's what they pay me to do. They pay me to think up solutions to philosophical problems. When it comes to free will, I don't have a solution that I can tell you what the problem is, but I don't have a solution to it. Yes?
If free will is supposed to be an illusion, then what's the evolutionary value of it?
Yeah, well, that's an argument I'm going to make. The argument I'm going to make is why did evolution give us the experience of the gap if the whole thing is a massive illusion? It's an illusion. It's extremely expensive because we spend an awful lot of our blood flow, to put it in terms that really matter. We spend a lot of blood flow on brain processes. There's an awful lot of blood going to the brain. All you need is an injury to the head, and you realize how much blood is going up there. I didn't know my scalp could produce so much blood as I did when I had a ski injury. But in any case, it's very expensive. Rationality is biologically expensive. If it doesn't do anything, if it's all written in the book of history anyway, if we're determined the same way plants are determined, then why did evolution give us this very expensive hunk of junk that isn't doing any work? I'll come back to that point. Okay, other questions at this point? Yeah?
You said you could state the problem, but you don't have a solution.
Right.
Could you explain exactly what the problem is?
Yeah, I will state it. Okay. I mean, that's the part of the lecture that's going to take about half an hour. Okay. I mean, stating the problem is not easy because it's typical in philosophy that half the battle is getting the problem stated. I mean, let me give you another analogy. I think in the end, the mind-body problem will be solved by neurobiology, by guys messing around in the brain. But the difficulty is you got to state it in a way that it's subject to empirical experiments and to empirical studies, and that's a very hard thing to do. And most of the research in neurobiology was frustrated by the fact that they were subject to philosophical confusions of various idiotic kinds. They thought, well, maybe consciousness is just a computer program. That's science. It's a computer. I won't get into that. But we'll get to free will. Okay, so here let's start off then with the idea that you approach the decision-making situation. Rationality comes into play only given an inventory of primary desires. You have this inventory of desires, and then rationality consists in figuring out how best to satisfy your primary desires. And more strictly speaking, a Bayesian conception of rationality, which is the most fashionable current conception, would be that rationality is a matter of making decisions based on a probability estimate as to which course of action is most likely to satisfy your desires, which is places you on a higher probability curve of satisfying your desires. You can't be certain about the effects, but you can make probability estimates. Now, there's several problems with that picture. The first one is that any desire is as good as another. As Hume says, reason is and ought to be the slave of the passions. And then he added one thing, which is one of my favorite quotations from Hume. It's a real gem. He says, "'Tis not contrary to reason to prefer the destruction of the entire world to the scratching of my little finger." Now, I think it is contrary to reason. And just try that down to real life. Barack Obama goes on television and he says, "I have consulted with the leaders of Congress and all of the Democratic candidates, and I have decided that I prefer the destruction of the whole world to the scratching of my little finger." We want him out of office because that is contrary to reason, and we ought to be able to explain why. But on this picture, on the model, on the classical model, and it isn't just Hume, but everybody holds this. So, I mean, the standard authors, Herb Simon, for example, says rationality is a hired gun. It works for whoever's got a set of primary desires. I'll tell you how to satisfy them. If your primary desires are to kill Jews or to commit suicide, well, fine. I'll tell you how to satisfy your desires, but rationality can't tell you what is a rational desire and what's an irrational desire. I think it should be able to tell you. If a guy said, look, what I want more than anything else in life is to eat leather briefcases, and I'm going to start by eating this one, okay? And much more than I want to lecture, I want to eat briefcases. Now, it's true, my brother-in-law, he likes to eat tables, so I'm pretty middle of the road compared to him. But I think this is a crazy desire, and I think we ought to be able to explain why that inventory of primary desires is subject to rational constraints. Well, let's start, though, with Williams's claim that there can be no such thing as an external reason for an action. Now, Williams's article is a subtle article on external and internal reasons, and I want you to read it carefully. One of the things I liked about Williams, aside from the fact he was smarter than anybody else, one of the things I liked about him was his philosophical examples were not the usual dumb philosopher's examples. They had a kind of real-life quality. He picks an example from an opera. He was an opera buff as well in that particular article. So his examples had a kind of reality, which most philosophers' examples don't have. But in any case, when you get through the complexity of the argument, I think the bottom line is rather simple, and here's how it goes. In order for a reason to be a reason for me, it has to be able to motivate me. It has to be able rationally to motivate me. And that's another way of saying it would have to be able to explain my behavior. It would have to be able to function causally in producing my behavior in such a way that the motive that I had was a part of or all of the explanation of the subsequent behavior. But there's no way a reason could do that unless it were part of my motivational set. It has to be part of my set of motives, my set of desires broadly construed, where that includes inclinations and dispositions and so on. But my set of desires broadly construed can be the only reasons for action that I have. Okay, that is, I think, the heart of the argument. Now, you've all read it, so if you think I'm misunderstanding him, I had a chance to argue about this with him at great length, so I have some reason to suppose I've got the interpretation right, that that's what he's driving at. The reason there can't be any external reasons for action is that reasons have to be able to motivate, and the only way something could motivate would be if it's part of the motivational set. That's the picture. Now, one immediate qualification we have to add, a lot of people misunderstand this as thinking that it follows that all reasons have to be egotistical. They all have to be self-centered. That doesn't follow. Somebody might have a primary desire to behave like St. Francis of Assisi. There's nothing, no egotism or egoism is implied by internalism. But the names internalism and externalism mark the view that on the internalist account, in order for a reason to be a reason for an agent, to be a rational constraint on an agent, or a rationally binding on an agent, it must either be or must appeal to something in the agent's motivational set. So you can tell me that I have a reason for brushing my teeth twice a day, even if I don't feel like brushing my teeth twice a day, if you can appeal to something else in my motivational set, such as my desire to have good teeth. And that's a classic case of reasons, ends means reasoning. I have an end, good teeth, and I reason about the means, and the means is better toothbrushing or something like that. So that's the picture that Williams has, is that if we're going to explain human behavior, then we have to explain it by appealing to motivations. But there's no way that a reason could act as a motivation unless it were part of an agent's motivational set. Okay, now I think that is the inheritor of a very long tradition. And I think, in fact, that is at bottom the same view as Hume's famous doctrine that you can't derive an ought from an is. Now, on the face of it, they look quite different. One says, no set of statements about how things are can entail what you ought to do. It doesn't, just saying what things are going to happen doesn't imply what you ought to do about them, or what the case is in the world doesn't imply what actions you ought to take. And the other one says, well, you can't have a reason for an action unless it appeals to something in your motivational set. I think at bottom those are the same view. Here's why. The word ought expresses reasons for action. The etymology is interesting. It's odd in English that we should have two words that mean pretty much the same. Very few English words are exact synonyms of other words. The famous example of exact synonyms are furze and gorse. Those are two names for a species of bracken that grows only in Scotland. And it's a famous example. When people are challenged to provide synonyms, they cite the example of furze and gorse. Okay, I inspected this species of bracken that grows only in Scotland, but anyway, it's very hard to find exact synonyms, but here are close synonyms. They are ought and should. Now, why the hell do we have these two words that do pretty much the same work? Ought and should. Well, I don't know, but if you look at the etymology, ought comes from the Old English verb meaning to owe. So in the Middle Ages, I would have said, I ought thee 30 ducats, but I paid thee last Michaelmas, meaning I owed you a certain amount of cash, but I paid you already. Should, on the other hand, well, I don't even have to look that one up. That smells of German. It's got Zolan screaming there, trying to get out. Inside, we ought to check it out. You ought to get on your Google and track it out and prove me wrong. But I never bother to look it up. I just assume there's some Zolan screaming out inside of should. Okay, what does ought and should do? They express reasons. And they have both a practical and, as linguists say, a practical and a theoretical sense. But to say you ought to do something is to say that there are good or overriding reasons for your doing it. Now, as I said, it's ambiguous. The sentence, they ought to be leaving the country by now, is several ways ambiguous. It can mean either they have good reason to leave the country by now, or the fact is that it's likely that they are leaving the country by now. That is the theoretical sense of they ought to be leaving, when it means there's good reason to suppose they are. But the primary meaning of ought is the practical, not the theoretical. That ought is ambiguous between it ought to be the case that, meaning we have good reason to suppose it is the case that. If I say it ought to rain in Berkeley before Christmas, that's a theoretical ought. It doesn't mean I'm pointing at you that rain gods get to work. No, it just means we have good reason to suppose it will rain before Christmas. But you ought to do your homework on time. I would normally be taken in the practical sense. Okay, ought expresses reasons, and in particular reasons for action in its practical sense. But what Williams is saying is something can be a reason for an action only if it appeals to something in your motivational set. And what Hume's doctrine that you can't derive an ought from an is says, no set of facts in the world will fix something as part of your motivational set. unless it already appeals to something in your motivational set. So I think, in fact, the doctrine that you can't derive an ought from an is, and the fact, or the claim that you can't derive an ought from an is, and the claim that there are no external reasons, are at bottom the same view. They have a certain conception of rationality, namely that rationality has to appeal to desire. Rationality is based on the desire. But to repeat, the desires needn't be egotistical. A person who wants nothing more to benefit than to benefit humanity, that's as rational as a person who wants to be completely egotistical on these grounds. So internalism does not imply egotism, though naturally it fits comfortably with egotism because an awful lot of people have a motivational set which is mostly concerned with their own satisfying their own selfish desires. Okay, what's the objection to it? Well, one of the objections to it is it's very hard to make it work in real life. I'm in a bar and I order a beer. They bring me the bill and I've already drunk the beer and the bill is $5. It's an expensive, well, maybe that's not so expensive anymore, but there was a time when $5 for a beer would seem like a lot of money. So I say to the waiter, I say, look, you've given me a bill for $5, but I have consulted my motivational set, and I feel no inclination whatever to pay this bill. I feel no desire whatever, and I've looked at all my other inclinations, my bill-paying inclinations, I feel no inclination whatever to pay for this beer. It's true I drank the beer, and I did enjoy it, excellent beer, but I feel no inclination to pay for it. And furthermore, I have read Hume and I have read Williams, and they have convinced me that unless I feel an inclination to pay for the beer, I have no reason whatever to pay for the beer. It isn't that I got sort of a reason, but I got other reasons against it. My reason for paying for this damn beer is zero. It counts nothing. There's no reason whatever. Because, as I said, I've read the standard authorities. You can't get smarter than Hume and Williams, probably as smart as any English philosophers that ever, well, Hume was Scottish, but anyway, the English claim him, as any English philosophers that ever lived, and that's the end of the discussion. Now, when I pointed this out to previous classes, they point out, yeah, but the guy might call the police, or something like that. Okay, we're out in the country, the telephone is out of order, and I'm bigger than he is, in case it comes to sheer physical force. So I have no prudential reason for paying for the beer. Now it seems to me I do have a reason for paying for the beer. Why? Well, given the background and given the network of the institutions in which we exist, by ordering the beer, I created a reason for paying for the beer. I, as we would say, undertook an obligation. What does that mean? I undertook an obligation to pay for the beer. And in this sort of case, if I undertake an obligation, well, an obligation is precisely a reason for an action. To recognize something as an obligation is to recognize it as a reason for an action. And the guy who says, well, it's true, I ordered the beer, and I drank the beer, and it was a good beer, and I understood the prices that you quoted, and all the rest of it, but I looked at my existing motivational set with my empiricist microscope, and I discovered nothing in my motivational set that inclines me to pay for the beer. Therefore, I have zero reason to pay for the beer. And to repeat, the point is not that I don't have a strong enough reason. I got all these reasons for keeping the money and all these reasons for the paying for the beer. I have zero. There's zilch reason for paying for the beer. Okay, now I think examples like this ought to suggest there's something fishy about the idea that a reason for an action has to appeal to something in your existing motivational set. However, let me take questions about that. Anybody want to say anything? Yes, at the back. The guy in the Giants cap. Yeah. Well, I think you do have a commitment. Now, leave out morality. Morality is kind of a heavy deal. But I think when you make a promise, you create a commitment. And in particular, a specific kind of commitment, an obligation. Now, what is an obligation? Well, back to etymology. Obligation comes from the same root as ligature, meaning tie. You are tied to paying the beer. When you created an obligation, you created a tie. You created a reason for yourself. And commitment is a weaker form, but it has to do with, well, there are two senses of commitment. There's a sense in which commitment implies obligation, and there's a sense in which commitment implies undertaking a course of action that is hard to retreat from, and both of those are present in this. When you speak of the general having committed his troops to the left flank, that's not an obligation, but it's a course of action that's hard to back away from. But in this case, where you have committed yourself to paying for the beer by ordering the beer, and you do that, you don't understand what ordering the beer is if you don't understand that. You order it, you know the price, and you drink it, then you have created an obligation, and an obligation is a reason for an action. Okay, everybody with me so far? Yes? You have to speak loud. I'm deaf today.
So, I would argue that if the person really had nothing in the original sense, he wouldn't have a reason to get beer. But that people do tend to have things in the original sense.
Yeah.
Besides things like I just love giving up $5. I mean, obviously they probably wouldn't have that, but they have things like I want to be part of this society.
Yeah.
Recognition, or they might just want to be just.
They might want to be
just.
Yeah, what does just mean?
Or they might want to be a law-abiding citizen.
Or a law-abiding citizen. See, the difficulty is that it's very hard to put it in a neutral terminology, because to say it's to be just is it seems to get very close to saying I want to do the right thing. And to do the right thing, well, that suggests there is something such as the right thing, which is independent of my desires. Say some more.
You don't even need wanting to be just. You
Yeah.
can just want to be. You can just
One of the crowd.
follow the law. You can just want to follow the law.
Yeah, okay. No, but here's the pointed example. Do I have a reason for doing it of a non-prudential kind? Of course, there are prudential reasons. The guy might call the police, or he might keep an eye out for me next time I come to the bar, or he might tell all my friends. I'm subtracting those. Arbitrary. Let's just wipe those out. I can give the guy a pill that'll make him forget all of those things. And in fact, I've already slipped a pill in the beer he's drinking. All the same, do I have a reason for paying for the beer? It seems to me I do. I created a reason when I undertook an obligation. Yes?
Yes, but the reason that you created, which is the obligation, is internal still. So
Yeah.
Williams can say, still you don't have any external reason.
Yes, but here is the point. I think it is internal in this sense. I have to know that there was an obligation. But the existence of the obligation does not imply that there is a desire on my part to fulfill the obligation. Now, what I'm going to argue in about 2 minutes is the recognition of the obligation, the recognition of the validity of the obligation can be the ground for forming a desire. I have to say can be, because it isn't always. You don't always have a desire to do the things that you know you have an obligation to do, but it can rationally provide a ground for the formation of a desire. Here's my paradox. All intentional, voluntary actions are expressions of a desire to perform that action. What do you want to do? I want to go to the dentist and have my tooth drilled. What, do you got a fetish about you, a masochist of some kind? No, I want to do that for some other reason. I want to have better teeth. Okay, that's a case of a motivated desire. Now here, the point here is the recognition of the validity of the reason can be the ground, a rational ground for forming a desire to fulfill the obligation. And that's the key point. Now, how is that possible? Well, one way to see that it's possible is to consider cases where it's absolutely unproblematic. And those are the theoretical cases. There's very bad news, let's say, from my doctor. He says I have a horrible case of what's-his-name's disease that is going to kill me in 6 months. I have a left-handed argygofraction ailment, which is going to kill me. I just invented that, so don't worry about it. It's not something we're likely to suffer from. I have an argiofraction. I have left-handed argiofraction, which is invariably the fatal kind. And it's going to kill me in 6 months. Now, here's the point. I don't want to believe that, but I have a reason for believing it. Namely, it's true. There is overwhelming evidence for its truth. It's irrational to deny it. I have a reason for believing something I don't want to believe. And if you think, well, believing isn't really an action, well, then substitute the word accept. I have a reason for accepting something I don't want to believe. And incidentally, irrational people, often refuse to accept something that they don't want to believe. They don't want to accept it. But you can have a reason for accepting something which you don't want to believe, and recognizing the validity of the reason will give you a ground for wanting to accept it. In the same way, recognizing the validity of the obligation can give you a ground for wanting to do the thing you recognize that you have an obligation to do. It doesn't always. People think, well, how come people don't always act on their obligations? Well, this is acrosia. They have all kinds of other reasons for not doing the thing that they recognize they have an obligation to do. The point I'm making now is that you cannot understand rationality if you don't see that there can be reasons for action that form the ground of the desire, even though the reason is not itself a desire. Now, here's the resolution of the paradox. The paradox was, if all voluntary intentional behavior is an expression of a desire to perform that particular form of behavior, then how can there ever be rational behavior that's not motivated by a desire? If the action is itself the expression of a desire to perform that action, where the hell does that desire come from? And the answer I'm giving to that is this. The recognition of the validity of a desire-independent reason for acting can form the ground of a desire to perform that action. And this matches our ordinary language. Why are you doing that? Why are you giving the guy $5? You don't want to give him $5. And the answer is because I'm under an obligation to pay it. I undertook an obligation to pay it when I ordered the beer. And why do I want to do that? Because I'm under an obligation. Now notice that the illusion we get here is, well, okay, then you want to fulfill your obligation. And that's just like wanting to drink the beer. No, it's not. Wanting to drink the beer is an inclination that I have independently of any desire-independent reasons for action. The recognition of the validity of the desire-independent reason for action can give you a ground for performing the desire to perform the action, even though the desire is based on a reason that is not itself a desire. Now, that's the key point. I'll take questions in a second. I just want to get this. This is a complex thought. I want to get it all out. The recognition of the validity of the desire-independent reason for action can be the ground of forming a desire to perform that action, even though the desire is not based on something that is itself a desire. And people, when I point this out to these economists in Chicago, they say, yeah, but that's because you got all these desires to fulfill your obligations. Yes, I do. But once again, you have the explanatory force back to front. My desire to fulfill my obligations is not like my desire to drink good beer as opposed to bad beer, to drink Optimator as opposed to that stuff they make in St. Louis. God. I was in a bar once and a guy ordered the St. Louis. Well, I don't want to tell you about that. I have one moral principle. Stay out of bar fights. Okay. So here I am, and I have a desire to fulfill my obligations, but it's not at all like my desire to drink good beer, because the recognition of the validity of the obligation, which is not itself a desire, is the ground of forming the desire to fulfill the obligation. That's the key point. And the recognition of the desire to fulfill the obligation is not itself a desire, though it can be the ground of forming the desire. That's the point I wanted to make. Okay, let's take more questions. You had your hand up first, and then you at the back. Yeah.
So how did Williams determine this? To me, it seems like Williams said it.
Yeah.
Whatever that motivates you.
Yeah.
But then you were specifically pointing out that there are two different kinds of this motivation.
Yeah.
There's a desire, and the other one is a desire that came from that.
Okay, here is, as always in philosophy, there are different pictures at work. Now, Williams has a very powerful picture. So powerful, in fact, that it's the dominant picture in our empiricist intellectual culture. And like so much in our best philosophical culture, it goes right back to David Hume. And here's the picture. You come to the decision-making situation. You come to the choice point, as they call it, with this inventory of desires. Rationality consists entirely in figuring out how to satisfy your desires. Now, I have a different picture. My picture shares with Williams the conviction that all intentional actions are expression of desires to perform that action. The question then for me is, how can there be desire-independent reasons for acting? And my answer is to take obvious cases like the bar case where there are, but then to take a theoretical type of case where it's obvious that you have a desire-independent reason, and that is the case where you've got evidence for accepting a proposition that you don't want to accept. You have evidence for believing or accepting something that's very unpleasant, but rationality can give you a reason for accepting that, even though it doesn't appeal to anything in your motivational set. So the way that I part company from Williams is this. He thinks rationality starts with an inventory of desires and then consists in trying to figure out how to satisfy the desires. I think rationality consists in starting with a whole inventory of intentional states, some of which are facts, all of which are factative entities. I haven't got to that part yet. We'll get to that. But some of these facts are facts about my behavior. I made a promise to the guy. I'm under an obligation. And the recognition of validity of those reasons for action can provide the ground of a desire that will motivate the action. So we all agree all actions are motivated by desires. The question is, where do the desires come from? And I'm claiming some desires are based on based on things that are not themselves desires. Now, the beauty of talking about rationality is almost all philosophical problems come in here. What I've said just has enormous implications for ethics and enormous implications for epistemology and all sorts of other subjects. And Kant, to his credit, saw this point. He saw that ethics has to be about desire-independent reasons for action. I mean, he's a bit tough. He says, well, if you always acted on your inclinations, it would be ethically irrelevant. I think that's a bit hard. So for Kant, the sweet old lady who always does a kind thing, and she's just naturally good-natured, she's of no moral interest whatever. But the mean skinflint who's always trying to rip people off, but one day heroically overcomes his inclination and does some generous act, that's morally interesting to Kant. So I don't go that far with Kant, but I do want to say that it is essential to understanding our conception of morality that is largely about a desire, inclination, independent reasons for action. If everybody always acted only on their inclinations, but by some magnificent hidden hand, it always worked out for the best for everybody, there'd be no need for ethics. You wouldn't need ethical considerations or ethical words, but life isn't like that. Life has all sorts of conflicting interests, and you need ethics to sort these out. And in large part, the study of ethics is a study of desire-independent reasons for doing things, even if you don't feel like doing it. Okay, other questions? So it's a complex argument, but I think everybody's kind of got it. Now the Giants fan is having a good day today. Go ahead.
Okay, so I'm trying to get this still. So this person at the bar who drink beer and whatever, you even bet all pay $5. You don't pay the guy $5. You don't have a prescription. There's no weakness of will. You never intended to.
Yeah.
You don't pay. What just happened? Why didn't you go on?
Well, there's two different guys. There is the guy who said, yes, okay, you told me all that stuff about obligation, and I've read Professor Searle, and I read all those guys, but I've also read Williams and Hume, and they taught me a deep truth, and that is to figure out whether or not I have a reason for doing something, consult your motivational set. And you find in it a bunch of desires. Now, you also find in the rest of your cognitive apparatus a set of beliefs about how to satisfy those desires. In my motivational set, I want good teeth. And then on my set of beliefs, I find the belief, in order to have good teeth, you got to do this boring stuff with a toothbrush. And you might, invent some story about how really it's a toothbrush symbolizes something that you find attractive or whatever. But basically, it comes down to the fact that you do this as a means to an end. But basically, you're satisfying your desires. Okay, now then, I am confronted with a situation where the guy wants $5. Why? I already drank the beer. I'm not going to get anything for the $5. And it's true, we've stipulated that there are no bad consequences to my not paying him. The memory pill is going to wipe out his memory. He won't even remember this in the future. And the phone is broken. He can't call the police now. And I'm the only guy in the bar. He can't appeal to help from other people. He hasn't even got a dog to bite me. So I have no prudential reason for paying for the beer. Do I have a reason for paying for the beer? And the answer is yes, of course I do. That's what it means to say that I undertook an obligation to pay for the beer. Okay, other questions? Because this is a crucial point. You understand this point, you'll understand a lot about ethics, rationality, and all sorts of other issues. Yes?
Could you go back to where you were arguing with the Chicago school people?
Yeah.
It seems like they would be uninterested in the source of desires and motivation.
Yeah.
And how did you get in an argument?
Okay, here is how their argument goes. Now, I'm the wrong guy to represent their views, but one of them I've asked you to read. That's Gary Becker. Becker wrote this article, which I think summarizes almost all of the views that I think are radically false. And so I want you to read it carefully. And it's how economists think, and I might say with catastrophic results. But in any case, here's the way that they presented it to me in Chicago. I say, well, look, I had a desire-independent reason for coming to Chicago. I didn't tell them what I thought of Chicago, and particularly Chicago that time of year. And they took me to what they thought was an Italian restaurant, and I was stunned. One of my favorite dishes in the whole world is spaghetti vongole. And when it's properly prepared, it is a great achievement, along with Michelangelo and Leonardo of Italian civilization. Well, the spaghetti vongole had vongole that came out of a can. That hadn't been in a shell in some years. The whole thing was disgusting. I didn't have time to tell them all that. I didn't even I didn't want to appear to be a provincial West Coast freak. Okay, so I didn't tell them any of that. But here I was in Chicago, and I said, all the same, I had a desire, independent reason. I promised you guys I would show up here. And they said, yeah, but that's only because we would think ill of you. And I didn't want to tell them, I don't give a damn what you guys think about me. But what the hell? I don't have to tell them that. But I did say, just subtract that. Let's suppose that I know you're going to forget the whole incident. Just discount that. And they're not used to thinking philosophically, where you can mess around with thought experiments. But I want to say, subtract all of the desire-independent reasons. Do I still have a reason for coming to Chicago? And the answer is yes, because I promised you guys I would. And they're very smart people, and I had a great time arguing with them. Their names are Becker, and what's that other guy's name? Posner. Becker and Posner. So you can read. They hold a view different from mine, or a whole bunch of views different from mine. Yes?
So, are you comfortable with the external reason always being accompanied by quite a few internal reasons, or do you feel that it can completely stand alone?
What I actually think is, you cannot have just one intentional state by itself. Remember when we talked about intentionality, I said you got to have a whole network, and you got to have a background. Now, in order for me to be able to operate with this stuff at all, I have to have a complete network of intentionality, a whole set of assumptions about how things behave, and a whole set of inclinations about the way I want to behave. But I also have a rational capacity to recognize that I can create desire-independent reasons for action. Now, there's a sense in which I think internalism is right, and I need to emphasize that. A desire-independent reason for action has always got to be created by the agent. You can't just arbitrarily create desire-independent reasons for action by other people. That is, suppose I get a letter from Australia saying, well, we've had a meeting of the entire faculty of the University of Sydney, and we have decided that you're under an obligation to pay us $1,000. That's just like the obligation you acknowledge to pay $5 to the bartender. And so we're going to create an obligation for you to pay us $1,000. Well, it doesn't work because there has to be some act on my part that binds me. You can't be bound unless you bind the will in some way. That's what promises do. They bind your will. You create something that is binding on the will, And I think, and now I haven't demonstrated this, but I think this is what drives internalism to some extent, and that is the feeling that I think is correct, that if it's really a desire-independent reason for action, then it must be something that I created. Now, I have to tell you, there is an odd fact, though, and I don't know how to cope with it, and that is I'm always finding people place me under an obligation, even though I have a theory that they can't. But they do. I mean, they come to the office and they say, and then I'm under an obligation. Now, it's the damn network in the background. But my own theory is that it's true that externalism is right. There are reasons for action that are independent of my inclinations. But in order to be valid, they've got to be related to my will. Whole lot of hands up. Now, let's you first, then you, then you. Okay? You first.
So you're saying that obligation comes from the network and background?
No, I'm saying obligations to be binding have to be created by you.
Okay, and so where did the obligation come from?
Okay, the obligation, in this particular case, came from my undertaking. When I order the beer, given the network in the background, I have undertaken, I've made a promise. I don't have to say I promise, I just say bring me how much is the beer? $5 for the best draft, bring me a beer. That is a promise, even though I didn't say I promise. So I created an obligation by a voluntary act of my will. I bound my will. And I hold the view, now maybe this is Protestantism, my upbringing getting out here, that I think it's not binding on you if you didn't create it for yourself. I mean, that Kant holds this view as well, the ultimate Protestant philosopher. And I don't know how to prove that, but I can't see how it could be binding on you if it's just something that happened, if it's just sort of imposed. However, I have to say that given my network and background, people are imposing obligations on me all the time. And I'm not quite sure how it works, but they do. They get away with it. Okay, you're next. You. Oh, you follow up.
Yeah, but how can the obligation that's binding not be internal?
Oh, what it is, the obligation is internal. I have to be able to recognize the obligation. But the obligation is not itself a desire. See, this is the whole point. The obligation can be an obligation to do something I don't want to do. It's 5 in the morning and the alarm clock goes off. And I think, I have to go to Chicago today. I got to go and stand in airports and take my shoes off and go to that horrible, humiliating scene. I'm going to sit in an airplane seat where some guy is trying to put his elbow where I want to put my elbow. You see, I mean, this is a horrible experience. I'm sure you've all had this experience. And then I'm going to eat airplane food. And then what happened when I get there? I'm going to be in Chicago. I'm going to be on the south side. And I didn't even know they're going to take me some dreadful, poor excuse for an Italian restaurant where they serve me canned vongole. I mean, it's a crime against humanity. But I have all these thoughts, and I think all the same, I made a promise. And so there I was in Chicago. Now, there was a payoff. I get to use this as an example in all sorts of lectures. But anyway, so you're satisfied for the moment. You're on.
Okay. So you said that there's certain cases where people come into your office, give you these obligations.
Yeah.
Why do they happen? Well, and you said, but you can only have an obligation unless you make it binding to yourself.
Yeah.
So now my question is, let's just say that in that case, because you've agreed, you've just somehow crazily, insanely decided to make it an obligation, created it as one. So therefore, that solves that problem. But then the obligation to pay for something or to do something is the reason. Then what reason do you have to fulfill that obligation? Like, what is the reason for that?
Okay. Now, this is a key point. I don't know if everybody at the back, but the idea is once you recognize that you have an obligation, what reason do you have for acting on the obligation? That's the question. And it looks like you're going to have an infinite regress, right? Because if I give you a reason, well, what reason have you got for following that reason? I don't think so. What is the concept of an obligation? And this was what I was trying to say earlier. It's a certain kind of tie. If you create an obligation, you have bound the will. And I hate using this 18th century terminology, but I don't have a better terminology. You have bound your own will. You have created a reason for doing something. And you don't need a reason for acting on that reason. It's like, well, how do you know it's a triangle? Well, it's a three-sided plane figure. Yeah, but how do you know that all three-sided plane figures are triangles? Well, that's the definition. Yes, but how do you know that's the right definition? Well, you can always play that game, but the point is you reach a point where the answer is That's just how it works. Once you recognize the obligation, you recognize that you have a reason for doing it. That's the whole point of having the institution of obligation. We don't have obligations the way we have thumbs. See, obligations are observer dependent. They have to be created by agents. And these are cases where, in my case, I've created an obligation, and now recognition of that obligation gives me a reason for action. You're next.
Yeah, so I think a lot of the confusion that I'm running into here is that when you explain this beautiful story of how reason produces, the recognition of a valid reason for doing something.
Yeah.
You ended it with it being the grounds for a desire.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't see how you're arguing with Williams if ultimately, sure, you can defer to the external
Yeah.
explanation, but it only makes sense if finally, in the end, you're referring to a desire of yours.
Well,
something in your being.
yeah. Where does the desire come from? You see, here are the two different pictures. Remember I said there are different pictures that Williams and I have. His picture is, this is the classical picture, it's in Hume. You come to the decision-making situation with an inventory of desires. You got a whole suitcase full of desires. And if you're rational, you will look, how do I satisfy these desires? And that is what you get in Gary Becker's article that I've asked you to read. Rationality consists in figuring out how best to satisfy your desires. Now, I have a picture that has another feature. Namely, you are capable of engaging in intentional behavior, and some of that intentional behavior will be designed to create obligations. That's what happened when I ordered the beer in the bar. Okay, but now when I create an obligation, I didn't create a desire. A lot of times people recognize an obligation and they don't want to do it all the same. That's why I say the recognition of the validity of the obligation can be the ground of forming a desire to perform it. And rationally, it is. Why do you want to do that? Why do you want to give that guy $5? He'll never know the difference if you don't give him $5 because he took the memory elimination pill. And the answer is, I want to give him $5 because I owe it to him. I have an obligation to pay him $5. Yes, Vanessa.
So it's internal insofar as you represent the external fact to yourself, but it counts as a
That's
motivating desire insofar as you act on it.
That's a very good point, and let me emphasize this. Of course, all rationality has to go on in the mind of the agent. So there's a sense in which all reasoning is internal. The facts in the world only function as reasons insofar as I internalize the facts. That's true of all, even the most self-interested actions. Why are you carrying an umbrella? Well, I looked out the window and I saw that it's raining. Now, the fact that it's raining is a reason for carrying the umbrella, but that reason can only function if I internalize it. If I see that it's raining, or believe that it's raining, or otherwise come to know that it's raining. So, of course, trivially, we're talking about what goes on in the mind of agents. That's where rationality gets worked out. The question is, are all of the elements of the rational processes of the agent, are all of them such that they require a desire in order to rationally result in an action? Now, later on, when I tell you the structure of rationality, I'm going to say they require the presence of at least one factative entity that has the famous uphill direction of fit. You can't do all of your reasoning with just these things because they'll never succeed in grounding an action, even an action of accepting something. So any rational process has to contain what I call at least one motivator. The important thing to see is motivators are not always desires. Sometimes you will have a motivator like the recognition of an obligation that will form the ground of a desire, even though it's not itself a desire. I'm putting off discussing free will as long as I can, but we're getting closer to it. Yes, you had your hand up. Yeah. Yeah.
You don't recognize the
Yeah.
validity of the draft, you don't
Yeah.
read it, until you get drafted and you're sort of put through this obligation.
Yeah.
You still
Okay. This was a situation a lot of people were in at the time of the Vietnam War. And one of the things that happened is that once the draft was abolished, opposition to the war declined spectacularly. So a fair amount of the opposition, not all of it, I was not subject to the draft, and I was still opposed to the war. but a certain amount of it was motivated by fear of the draft. Okay, now there are two separate situations. I think the normal situation is this. You recognize that you have an obligation to fulfill your legal requirement of being drafted, but you also recognize you have other moral obligations that you think overcome that, you think override the obligation to allow yourself to be drafted. Now, this is very hard for for people in our culture to accept, and that is there can be valid but conflicting reasons for action. The idea is always to think, well, if the war was immoral, then the obligation of the draft was zero. That doesn't follow. You still had an obligation. It's just that the obligation was overridden by the immorality of the war. Now, that would be my description of that. There is another case, and that's the guy who's the pure anarchist, who thinks, I have no obligations to this or any other government, and consequently I have no obligation to pay my taxes, be drafted, or anything else. That guy is rare. The normal guy is the guy who has all kinds of obligations and recognizes that he has an obligation to register for the draft, but all the same he thinks his obligation is overridden by the obligation to avoid killing people unnecessarily. You follow that? That's a very important point. And for some reason, in our intellectual culture, it's hard for people to recognize that there can be valid, conflicting reasons, morally valid, conflicting reasons for an action. The idea is, well, if there was a reason that overrides the others, then the others weren't real reasons. That doesn't follow. They're perfectly good reasons. It's just they don't triumph. Yes? Yeah.
But it seems to me that if a person was faced with the decision whether or not to pay $5, and nobody would remember, there was zero physical consequences, and he had no fear of feeling guilty afterwards,
Yeah.
no fear of any emotional consequences
Yeah.
for himself, and there would be absolutely nothing bad happening to him,
Yeah.
nothing good happening to him, then I don't think he would do it.
Okay. You don't think he would do it?
I don't think he would do the $5.
Well, now wait a second. Now we're not asking for a prediction. We're asking for rationality. If the guy, let's construct the case pure. The guy knows that the bartender has taken a memory pill such that he will forget it all, but he also took the pill himself so that there's no chance that he might feel guilty about it afterwards. Does he all the same have a reason for paying for the beer? And the answer I'm giving is yes, of course he does. He undertook an obligation. Now you say, yeah, but in a situation like that, he wouldn't. But that's an empirical prediction on your part that at bottom we're all deadbeats. Maybe we are, but that's not the question. The question is, what rational basis do we have for acting? Go ahead.
But your point is that he would still if there was no case where a person would still pay for the beer, even if it was zero consequences, emotional or otherwise, for not doing it, and there were zero benefits for doing it. If that's only a theoretical thing, but it would never happen, then I don't see how that reason would ever be effective. Obviously the reason's not effective.
Yeah, because the reasons are effective. This goes back to the point I made earlier when we talked about social ontology. The glue that holds human civilization together is this invisible network and background of reasons for acting, which enable us to coordinate our behavior in ways that are quite unlike my dog Gilbert. I'm going to bring Gilbert to class so you see the guy I'm talking about. Gilbert socializes very well with other dogs, and they get on, but they don't get together as we do to have a sort of doggy lecture and reason about this kind of stuff. And they don't have, all they can do is act on their inclinations. And what you do when you train your doggy is you try to give him inclinations he wouldn't otherwise have. So you train him in such a way that when you shout to come and he comes, then he gets bribed. He gets a reward. And he begins to expect the reward. Even when you run out of the rewards, he'll still come. But human behavior is different because in the case of human beings, they are capable of acting on reasons that are not desires. That's the amazing thing. Even though, of course, in order to be effective, the desire-independent reason has to be the ground of a desire to fulfill the reason. Yes?
So this is what I was still confused about is that, you say that there is a desire-independent
Yes.
reason for action.
Yeah.
But in order to make it an explanation, you still have to go back to a desire.
I don't go back to a desire. I generate the desire.
You still need a desire.
Yeah, I don't have a desire, right.
And so the reason for acting is still dependent on a desire.
No, not quite. Let's state this precisely. The action is dependent on a desire, because if you didn't want to do that, you wouldn't be able to do it. That is, if you didn't want to go to the dentist or fulfill your obligation, the question is, where does that desire come from? What's the ground of the desire? See, the picture that these guys have is, well, these desires are just yens we have. I suddenly, once when I was a student in Oxford, I suddenly had a passionate urge to eat a dill pickle. Well, there was no place you could find a dill pickle in Oxford University in my childhood. I ran around all the places in town. Talk about absence of civilization. You couldn't buy a dill pickle. Well, okay, I had a passionate urge for a dill pickle. No such. But that's an oddball desire, I have to admit. Now, there are all sorts of desires that are not like that. There aren't just yens that overcome me. I really would like a cold glass of draft beer right now. But my urge to keep my promise is not like that. It's a grounded desire. Yes, I do want to do this because it keeps my promise. And why? Well, because it's a promise, because I undertook an obligation. Yeah.
So, I mean, go back to what Arden was saying. I see how you produced a desire to act.
Yeah.
You produced a reason for
Yeah.
acting. But I think the point that we were trying to get at was that until you have done that, it's not that he wouldn't so much as you don't have an explanation for why he would.
No, but I have an explanation for why he would. He recognized an obligation.
Yeah.
You see, now I want to tell you, the discussion we're having now is not new. One of the worst passages in Kant is where he cheats in his usual way on precisely this question. It's at the end of, and I might bring it in class and read it aloud. It's at the end of the groundwork of the metaphysical morals, and he's confronted with this deep question. How can pure reason ever become practical? How can the categorical imperative ever motivate an actual action? How can it provide the ground of a desire? And then he cheats. He says, well, I can't answer that question because to do that, I'd have to explain how the noumenal relates to the phenomenal, how the world of things in themselves relates to the world of appearances. But it does happen, but the only way it could happen is because acting on the categorical imperative infuses a feeling of pleasure. That's how the translators do it. What he's saying is you couldn't ever keep your promise in this bar case unless it was fun, unless it infused a feeling of pleasure. And I think that's a mistake. The feeling of pleasure comes from the recognition that you had an obligation, which was not an urge. The obligation itself was not an urge to pleasure. So Kant is confronted with precisely this, and I think his answer is not as good as mine. But that's because largely it's a cheat. It just says, well, there's no way to answer this question because you'd have to explain how the world of things in themselves relates to the world of phenomena. Okay, I want to go on now, unless somebody's got an urgent question now, because this is important. I mean, I promised you early on I would explain how desire-independent reasons for action could ever motivate, given that every action is an expression of a desire to perform that action. And if you have doubts about that, just think of the theoretical case, where you have reasons for accepting something that are overwhelming, even though you don't want to accept it. You don't want to accept that the people you most care about are going to die, for example, but they are, and you have to accept that. You have a ground for accepting it, even though it's no fun. Okay. Oh, by the way, and of course, that's what motivates a lot of self-deception. The self-deceptions are more pleasant than facing up to the reality. Well, I guess we're going to have to face free will. How much time did I leave? Oh, my God. Well, that's not too bad. I can do 15 minutes without acute pain on the subject of free will. Okay, what exactly is the problem of the freedom of the will? Well, before answering that question, let me illustrate an apparent solution to the problem. We can see what the problem is if we see why an apparent solution to the problem doesn't really solve the problem. This solution is famous, and one of its chief architects, as you might have guessed, is Hume. And it's called Compatibilism. and is sometimes, it was called by William James. William James is a marvelous author, and we should probably read more of his stuff than I do. It's so good that I can't really bear to read it. I mean, I often think, I wish I'd written it. I like William James. They gave a dinner in his honor at Columbia, and all these heavy-duty philosophers there, and some famous logician got up and said, now you believe this, and you believe this, and you believe that, and then he did a derivation, which was appalling for William James. And William James just said, I never was any good at logic. But in any case, I don't know if he was good at logic, but he was good at nomenclature, and he called compatibilism soft determinism as opposed to hard determinism, which is the view that we're determined in a way, in some stronger sense, than the compatibilist sense. Here's compatibilism. There is apparently a conflict between free will and determinism. The person who believes in free will thinks that some of the things that happen to us are determined, our digestive processes are entirely determined, but some of the things we do of our own free will. I raised my right arm, but I could have raised my left arm. I raised my right arm of my own free will. So some of my actions are determined, and some of my actions are my own free will. Now, says the soft determinist, of course, all of my actions are determined because they're all part of the causal network. All of my actions are determined by antecedent causes. So when I raised my right arm, that was determined just as much as my digestion was, but it was determined by a different kind of cause. It was determined by my internal desires and my internal reasons. So when I raised my arm, that was a case of a free action, even though it is completely determined. Now, on this view then, all actions are determined because all actions are part of the causal network. It follows. Every event has a cause. The cause determines the event. Actions are events. Therefore, actions have determining causes. I mean, I could write it out, but you can do it on your own. There are different ways of doing it. But determinism seems to follow from certain rather obvious assumptions that we make about nature, that everything has a causal explanation, and the causal explanation explains why the thing that happened had to happen. It gives a deterministic explanation. But, says the compatibilist, the fact that everything is determined doesn't imply that nothing is free, because there are some actions that are caused by internal causes, such as our reasons for acting, and those are what we call free actions. And indeed, the compatibilist has an argument that goes back to ordinary language philosophy that says, this is a paradigm case of a free action. I'm walking across the room, but I could turn around and walk in the other direction. That's where we learn the meaning of expressions like acting of your own free will, a free action. So are some actions free? Of course. The words free action have a meaning. That meaning is explained by giving paradigm examples. But everything is determined, including all free action. So free will is true, determinism is true, and free will is compatible with determinism. It's just that there are certain determined actions that are caused by certain sorts of internal causes, and those are what we call free actions. I raise this arm as opposed to this arm. Those are free actions, but like everything else in the universe, they're completely determined. Now, to my amazement, I say most philosophers today accept that. That is a widely accepted view. For example, Bernard Williams. I'm sorry, I shouldn't say Williams. But Donald Davidson, definitely talking about colleagues of my own. Donald Davidson definitely accepted soft determinism. I don't know about Bernard. I never discussed this with him. But this is a widely held view in philosophy. I think it's mistaken. But why is it mistaken? Well, it changes the subject. Let me attack it. Suppose it's right. Suppose that the way we ordinarily use these words, there are some actions that are determined that we call free. That's not what worried us. What worried us is a question that can be stated without using the words freedom and determinism at all, without using the concept of free will. Here it is. Are all human actions such that for every action there was a set of antecedent causes sufficient to fix that action, that were causally sufficient to produce that action? Now, you can state that question without using the words free will and determinism. That is a question about causation. Is it the case for every single action that the action was preceded by antecedent causes which were causally sufficient for that action? What does that mean, causally sufficient? That means given the statement of the causes and the relevant laws, you can deduce that the action will occur, and the supposition that the action does not occur is actually logically inconsistent with the statement of the initial conditions and the causes. And the model, of course, is causation in physics. If I describe the laws operating on this piece of chalk and I describe the initial conditions where I release it, you can deduce that it's going to fall. The causes were sufficient to fix that event. That event has causally sufficient conditions. Now, the question for free will and determinism is whether or not every human action is like this object falling. If I were a conscious piece of chalk, I might think, well, it's a tough life having to make up my mind every day. Am I going to fall down or up? It's up to me, of course. I could go up if I felt like it, but what the hell? Everybody kind of expects me to go down, so I'll go down. That would be an illusion. The chalk might have the illusion that it acted of its own free will, but our question is, do we similarly have an illusion? Compatibilism doesn't answer our question. It changes the subject. The question was not, is there a use of the word free, which is such that it's compatible to say the action was of my own free will and still determined. I think there is, but it's beside the point. When people march down Telegraph Avenue carrying signs that say freedom now, they don't mean remove the laws of physics. They want the government to get off their backs or something like that. Okay, fine. Let them have that kind of freedom. We're interested in something else. And what worries us can be stated without using the notions of freedom and determinism, just using the notion of causally sufficient. Are all actions such that they are preceded by causally sufficient conditions for that action? And that's what we want to know. If that's true, then there is no such thing as free will. If it's the case that some actions are not preceded by causally sufficient conditions, then free will is true. But notice, free will and determinism were not used to state the problem. The problem can be stated without using those notions. Once we've got the problem stated in terms of causally sufficient conditions, then we can introduce those expressions if we still want to do it. Okay, does anybody want to ask about compatibilism? I am not sure what motivates compatibilism, because it seems to me obviously changing the subject. The subject is not, is there a use of free such that on that use free actions are compatible with determinism? Seems to me there clearly is. So what? I think the reason is this. Most people who talk about free will and determinism aren't interested in free will and determinism. They're interested in something that they call moral responsibility. You look at the literature and you'll be amazed how often the author says he's going to talk about determinism, and he's often running about moral responsibility. And I find this offensive because I'm interested in determinism. I don't really care about moral responsibility. Maybe there's an interesting question about moral responsibility, but determinism seems to me a much more important question. Why do they care so much about it? Well, I'm not sure, but I think it's something like this. If compatibilism were the right way to look at it, then we might be able to hold people morally responsible for actions that we knew were completely determined. So it seems, it's hard for the determinists to say, well, you can't blame Hitler. Look at his upbringing and the kind of environment he lived in. So it had to be that way. But the soft determinists, I think, can say, well, all the same, you can blame him, even though, of course, all his actions were determined. I think that's a kind of cop-out, but I think that's what drives a lot of this discussion, is that people want to be able to apply the notion of moral responsibility to actions that they believe to be completely determined. Yes?
I mean, I think another reason why compatibilism gets so much play is that it's not immediately obvious why free will, in the sense we're talking about now, is important or useful.
Is important or useful, yeah. Well, let me go on with this thought. I mean, I don't know if people at the back could hear the question. Hume, as always, forces the issue, because Hume says not only is freedom compatible with determinism, but in fact free will presupposes determinism. For suppose determinism wasn't true, then your actions would be random. See, you voted for somebody in the last presidential election. Now suppose determinism wasn't true. Well then, there would be no explanation of your action. It would just be a random occurrence. You'd get no credit for it. So in order that there should be such a thing as praise or blame, moral responsibility, credit or discredit, all of those presuppose determinism. So this is Hume now on the attack. First of all, he says free will is compatible with determinism, and now he says free will, if it's a useful notion, presupposes determinism, because unless your behavior is determined, it is completely random, and randomness does not give you genuine freedom. Free will is not just a form of randomness. Okay, so we've got a stronger claim now, not just that free will and determinism are compatible, but in fact, free will requires determinism. We blame people for their character and their decisions, but unless those character and decisions were determined, there'd be nothing to blame them for. How about that? Are we getting closer to posing the question? Somebody else had a hand up over here.
I was just curious about the self-determinism part, that the physical actions, the physicality is determined, but the intentionality is free.
No, everything's determined. Everything is determined on the account of soft determinism. It's just there are some actions that are determined by a certain kind of causes and not by other causes. There's a distinction between the guy who is in the grip of a heroin addiction, and that guy literally can't help himself. Now, there is another guy who freely decides to take the extra drink of scotch at the party, but that guy's behavior is completely determined. That is, the causes of his taking the extra scotch are completely determined. Yeah, the picture is this. It's written in the book of history. At the time of the Big Bang, 13 billion years ago, every move you made was entirely fixed. You reached up now to scratch your head. That was predictable 13 billion years ago. At that instant, your arm would go up and scratch your head because the causes determined it. Everything is causally determined in this mechanical universe, but some of those we call free because they're determined by certain kinds of causes. I think that's a cop-out. I'll tell you why on Thursday.